The swish of silk was the first noise to cut through the haze of sleep, a faint whisper brushing against the heavy stillness of dawn. After it came the low, muffled chatter of eunuch guards positioned just outside the chamber door, their tones a steady drone that seemed to hum through the stone walls themselves. The atmosphere in the small space was thick and suffocating, drenched with the sweet, smoky aroma of rare incense and the clinging perfume of orange blossoms drifting upward from the palace gardens. A fragrance meant to signal grandeur, but to the little girl rising on her narrow mat, it only carried the stifling scent of captivity. She was Theodora, only 6 years old, and this was the gilded cage of the Hippodrome's faction quarters in Constantinople. The year was 500 AD, and the sprawling metropolis beyond these walls throbbed like a chaotic heart of empire. But inside this confined chamber, reserved for the household of a beast-keeper, her reality was woven from hushed whispers and the ceaseless vigilance of the Greens. An icy dread, familiar and crushing, settled in her stomach as soon as her eyes opened. It was the same fear that had anchored itself 3 days before, a cold stone of certainty she had carried without pause since then. Her father, Akasus, was gone. The strong figure who smelled of hay and animals, who could soothe a raging bear with nothing more than a calm tone and a steady hand, had been struck down by a fever that consumed him with merciless speed. His absence hung in the air, more tangible than the incense smoke. From the larger chamber beyond she could hear the muffled, ragged sobs of her mother, a sound now as constant as the guards' murmuring. Her 2 elder sisters still lay asleep, curled close together for warmth and comfort. Theodora remained perfectly still, listening. She listened to the signs of the complex awakening, the dysts. Tant roar of a caged beast, the clatter of buckets, the shouts of men preparing for another day of spectacle. Life continued, wholly indifferent to the private collapse within their family. The grandeur around them felt like a cruel jest. The silken drapes, the polished mosaic floor, the glimpse of manicured gardens. None belonged to them. They belonged to the Green faction. They were the fragile trappings of borrowed patronage. And now, with her father's death almost certainly withdrawn, this chamber, this existence, was on loan, and the payment had come due. The fear was not merely of hunger, but of the streets, of being expelled from this gilded cage into the raw, merciless city with nothing and no one to catch them. She clutched the thin blanket tighter around her small shoulders, as if she could retreat from the daylight and the cruel choices it would demand of her family. For all its gold, the cage had never felt more like a prison. Before plunging deeper into these buried stories of struggle and survival, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, make sure to tap that like button and subscribe for more storytelling like this. And please leave a comment below sharing where you're listening from. I find it amazing that together we're rediscovering these ancient tales from every corner of the world, connected through time and curiosity. 3 days of muted dread ended in a frantic, desperate ritual. Theodora's mother moved about their cramped chamber with a feverish urgency. Her hands trembled as she spread out their finest tunics. Once brilliant in the Green faction's colours, the garments had dulled and grown threadbare, their seams stretched and fraying, each stitch a reminder of a wealth that had never been theirs, each patch a monument to a life forever on the edge of ruin. The cloying fragrance of incense and blossoms still hung in the air, now tamed by the metallic tang of fear. Her mother's hands felt icy as she closed the small buttons at the back of Theodora's neck. The touch was hurried, desperate, a cruel contrast to the gentle, steady hands that had cared for her only a week earlier. Theodora stood rigid, watching her sisters being prepared in the same way, their young faces pale and bewildered, eyes wide with a terror they could not name, yet understood. They were being dressed for a sacrifice, adorned for a petition to gods long known to be cruel and unpredictable. With a final trembling sigh, their mother gathered them, herding them like delicate lambs. She said nothing, her voice locked behind walls of terror. She only seized the smallest hand and guided them out of the chamber, into the cool, shadowed passageways of the faction complex. The usual roar of the hippodrome, the cheers of the crowd, the growls of beasts, were muted this morning, replaced by the echo of their footsteps striking marble. They were led into a long, lavish hall where the leaders of the Green faction lounged upon cushioned couches. Sunlight streamed through high-set windows, casting dust motes that sparkled like flecks of gold, a sharp contrast to the despair settling over Theodora's family. The men reclined in silks far richer than theirs, their fingers weighed down with rings, their faces full and smooth. They looked up as the small, shabby procession entered, their gazes not curious, but faintly irritated by the interruption. Theodora's mother stepped forward, her voice a fragile, cracking thread that echoed in the wide space. Words spilled from her lips in a desperate, pleading rush. She spoke of her dead husband, of his years of loyal service, of his mastery with the beasts that had brought glory and wealth to the Greens. She begged not for alms, but for another chance to fill his post, for the meagre wages that stood between her daughters and starvation. Her once strong voice now wavered, each word an act of humiliation. The men heard without listening. Their faces were carved masks of apathy. One, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and empty eyes, inspected his fingernails as she pleaded. Another idly swirled wine, his gaze floating past the children as though they were mere decorations in the hall. Their survival was nothing more than an unwelcome noise. When her voice faltered into silence, the man with bored eyes flicked his wrist. A tiny, effortless gesture, a dismissive wave that carried the weight of a death sentence. It meant nothing. It meant ruin. A guard stepped forward, not to lead them, but to shove them roughly back toward the doors. The sound that chased them was not silence nor mercy, but laughter. A cold, mocking laughter that echoed in the vaulted hall, pursuing them into the blinding streets outside. The radiant Constantinople sun struck like a blow after the dim hall, and the cruel laughter seemed to sear itself into the stone beneath their feet, a permanent stain of disgrace. They stood blinking in the harsh light, their faded finery now mocking them, the street dust already settling on their tunics, the first sign of their new despair. The laughter of the green hall still rang in Theodora's ears, drowning out the city's noise. Her mother stood frozen, shoulders slumped in utter defeat. The sunlight caught the tear tracks carved into the dust on her cheeks. Then, slowly, a new and desperate resolve hardened her face. Her red-rimmed eyes scanned the bustling avenue until they fixed on the rival faction's imposing complex. Without a word, she gripped Theodora's hand and her sister's with sudden fierceness, pulling them toward the blue faction's gates. He was a provincial governor from the North African Pentapolis, a man of genuine authority and duty, his stance rigid with the weight of office rather than the laziness of inherited luxury. He did not scatter coins. He observed her acts with a quiet, piercing focus, and when he finally came to her, it was not in the frenzied crush of fans, but in a moment chosen with care. His offer was not one of silver for a night, but a title for an entire lifetime. He promised her not the fleeting blaze of stage lights, but the steady radiance of a new homeland. He urged her to leave the hippodrome, the factions, the dust, and the disgrace of Constantinople, and to travel with him to Pentapolis as his acknowledged consort. The words lingered in the air, gleaming with the promise of legitimacy. It was not romance, he declared. She was too wise to believe such stories, but it was release. It was a chance to escape the crushing weight of her past, to cast off the skin of the actress and become something entirely new, a respected woman beside a powerful figure. The idea was a clean, sharp breath in lungs long choked with incense and sweat from the arena for a decade. It felt like absolution. It felt like a door opening onto a future she had never dared picture. Without pause, her heart racing not with dread, but with reckless, unrestrained hope, Theodora embraced it. She turned her back on the only world she had ever known and walked toward the waiting vessel without a single look behind. The voyage to Africa was a test of endurance, a ceaseless rocking that echoed the uncertainty of her fragile new place. The ship, a solid merchant vessel, cut through waves rising like black liquid peaks before collapsing into troughs of foaming white. The air once thick with the familiar scent of Constantinople, incense, humanity, the sea thinned into something salt-scoured and strange. For a while the novelty of the passage, and the honour she received as Hassabilis' companion, acted as comfort. She stood at the railing beside him, the wind tearing at her hair, watching the Libyan siege. Ost slowly formed through the haze, a streak of ochre and muted green beneath a blazing sky. In the provincial heart of Pentapolis, she was welcomed with a respect she had never known. Her every need tended to by quiet servants. She moved through sun-baked courts and dined in halls open to the stars, and for a fleeting season the golden cage of her past seemed truly broken. But governors are recalled as easily as they are appointed, and the summons from Constantinople when it came was abrupt and final. Hassabilis' face, usually a mask of measured command, hardened into lines of cold practicality. The preparations for departure were swift, efficient, and excluded her completely. The silks and jewels he had bestowed upon her were gathered not in her chests, but his. The attendants who had once bowed now turned away. The promise of a new life soured into the bitter taste of transaction, and she grasped with a sinking certainty that her worth had been spent. He left her upon the docks of Alexandria as one discards an emptied wineskin. The vast harbour was a storm of shouting stevedores, straining ropes, and the cries of gulls. The ship that had carried her to this moment was being prepared to carry him away, its sails swelling with a wind that smelled of home, his home. He did not glance back as he crossed the gangplank. There was no farewell, no coin pressed in her palm, not even the decency of a lie. He simply stepped aboard and became part of the vessel, a figure dissolving into the machinery of his ambition. The gangplank was pulled away, the ropes released, and the ship began to glide toward open water, leaving her stranded upon the sun-bleached boards. The blaze of the Egyptian sun fell upon her then, a weight that felt less like warmth and more like judgment. It bore down on her uncovered head, scorched the timber beneath her thin sandals, and glared from the white, washed walls in a blinding fury. She was entirely alone. 1,000 miles of hostile sea lay between her and the only home she had known, and the voices swirling around her, were a clamour of alien tongues. The craft she had, the polished smile, the alluring dance, the perfectly timed tear, was the very same she had vowed to abandon on Constantinople's stages. It was the only wealth she held, and the awareness of it was a disgrace deeper than anything she had endured in the Hippodrome. The vessel shrank to a speck on the horizon, and Theodora was left with nothing but the searing sun and the endless, indifferent sea. The city of Alexandria, once a merciless judge, became a witness to a slow and desperate change. Hunger was a fiercer master than any faction chief, and it drove Theodora through the twisted lanes of the city, a shadow haunting the arcades and bustling markets. She slipped among the crowds like a murmur, her once proud bearing bent beneath the weight of survival. The talents that had made her a star of the Hippodrome, the gift to read an audience, to radiate an aura, to seize attention, were now turned to a darker, urgent craft, the skill of vanishing. She discovered which bakeries spared crusts at closing, which stalls were left poorly guarded, which alleys offered brief, uneasy shelter. The roar of applause was replaced by the gnawing hollowness in her stomach, a far harsher critic. Her aimless steps, steered by despair she had never felt, brought her at last to the threshold of a small, unremarkable chapel, hidden away from the city's wide avenues. It was a refuge for the monophysites, Christians who believed in the single divine essence of Christ, a creed opposed to the sanctioned orthodoxy of Constantinople. Weary, emptied out, she slipped inside, drawn not by devotion, but by the relief of shade and the scent of charity, coarse bread and sour wine given to the broken. She accepted the food with shaking hands, her head lowered, not in prayer, but in shame. Yet as she lingered in the cool dimness, something unexpected stirreth. Erdiosed, the voice of the patriarch, rising in fervent Greek, began to seep past her hunger and humiliation. He spoke not of a distant condemning deity, but of a Christ who suffered, who was cast out and mocked, who shared the anguish of the forsaken. He spoke of a faith itself oppressed, a people united not by privilege but by struggle and defiance. It was a theology of the outcast, and it struck a deep, unshakable chord in her. In the dust of that foreign chapel, among whispered prayers of the rejected, Theodora found not only comfort, but a vessel for her fury. Her conversion was no gentle stirring of spirit, but a fierce and deliberate reshaping of her soul. The theatrics of her former life were reborn in a new identity, a penitent, a fiery convert, a woman redeemed not by man, but by God. She gave her services to the patriarchs, not as an actress, but as a scribe, a courier, a discreet observer. Her mind, once bent to comedy and mimicry, now hungrily devoured the tangled threads of theology and politics. She learned how dogma swayed rulers, how bishops bent law, how the altar and the throne were no separate realms, but one writhing serpent of power. She absorbed the whispered strategies in the chapel's back chambers, committing to memory every name, every feud, every ambition. The ache in her stomach was slowly replaced by another, colder craving, a thirst for control, for safety, for authority that could not be cast aside on a dock. In the crucible of Alexandria, a new hunger took root in her, forged in betrayal and faith, and it was far harder than the old. Her return to Constantinople became a pilgrimage of another sort. The ship that bore her across the wine-dark sea was no governor's craft, but a humble trading vessel, its beams heavy with grain and oil, and one woman's hardened will. Theodora stood by the railing, no longer a companion to influence, but its apprentice. Entis, her eyes locked on the horizon where the legendary city would rise. The salt spray stung her skin like baptism, cleansing away the remnants of the actress, the mistress, the forsaken woman. She came back not to the life she had fled, but to a stage crafted by her own hand. The year was 522 AD, and the woman who stepped once more onto the chaotic docks of the Golden Horn was a being entirely remade from the one who had left. She did not return to the raucous, gaudy compound of the Blue faction, nor any haunt that recalled the girl from the Hippodrome. Instead, with a handful of coins saved from her service to the Alexandrian priests, she rented a modest, unadorned house tucked into the crooked streets climbing the hill toward the Grand Palace. Its bare walls were whitewashed, its only grace, a slim opening between taller buildings, a glimpse of the palace's soaring domes, and the imperial standard snapping in the wind. It was a choice made with care. Modesty was her costume now, and she wore it with the precision of a master performer. In the center of that sparse room, she set a spindle and distaff. Each morning, as the city stirred with the clamor of trade and intrigue, Theodora seated herself by the small window and took up the wool. Her hands, once trained for graceful gestures of dance and delicate brushes of paint, now learned the coarse, repetitive rhythm of spinning. The rough fibers burned her palms, her daily penance, a constant reminder of her chosen road. For hours she worked, the spindle whirring, her posture bent in the pose of toil and piety. To any passer-by, whether a palace servant, a priest, or a nosy neighbor, she was the picture of repentance, a woman who had abandoned sin for the discipline of humble labor. But her gaze, when lifted from her task, was not the gaze of a meek soul. It was the gaze of a tactician, missing nothing. She tracked the patterns of palace officials, the timings of guards, the routes of senators. The hum of the spindle marked her patience, a steady drumbeat as she waited. She had placed herself within reach of power, a spider poised at the edge of the web, weaving her own strand. She was a modest, harmless figure with a tale of redemption sure to stir the devout and the mighty alike. She waited with the certainty of a predator, knowing the right eyes would find her. The wool between her hands was not merely thread, it was the first line of the rope she would climb back to power, and this time she would not release it. The moment came not with spectacle, but with the steady echo of imperial footsteps along the cobbled street before her door. Justinian, nephew to Emperor Justin, was a man whose path through the city brought silence and bowed heads in its wake. His reputation swept before him like a chill wind, a man of formidable mind, stern in bearing, consumed by the endless detail of law and order. Theodora sensed the approach before she saw it, the rhythm of guards' strides, the low murmur of counselors. She did not leap to the window. She remained seated, her hands still, her back subtly straightened. This was the convergence she had crafted through months of quiet patience. As his shadow crossed her doorway, she raised her eyes. It was not the timid glance of a spinner, nor the bold invitation of an actress. It was a look direct, unwavering, assessing. Her gaze met his, and in that instant the separation between the imperial nephew and the woman at her wheel collapsed. He was used to eyes that dropped in fear or narrowed in calculation. He was unaccustomed to being truly seen by a woman who held no trace of intimidation. He stopped. The retinue behind him faltered. The silence thickened, electric. Without rising, without even a hint of supplication, Theodora spoke. Her voice, trained once to reach the highest rows of the hippodrome, was low and steady, stripped of artifice. She did not flatter him or beg for favor. She challenged him. She cited a res edict, a law on property debated in the Senate, and she presented a counter-argument. It was not the reasoning of a scholar repeating texts, but of a mind that grasped how laws pressed upon the lives of real people. She spoke of overlooked outcomes, of loopholes that advantaged only the elite, of a fairer interpretation. Justinian stood motionless, his severe face shifting from shock to deep fascination. Before him was no flatterer, no ornament. Before him was a mind bold and incisive, meeting him on the only ground he revered, the brutal chessboard of law. He saw intelligence burning in her gaze, confidence in her stance, born not of noble rank but of will. She debated him as an equal, her words precise, her reasoning flawless. The dusty street, the guards, even time itself seemed to vanish. There was only the woman in the humble house and the brilliant argument she spun, a fabric far richer than any wool. He, a man who had conquered the world with logic, found himself captivated by a woman unafraid to wield hers to meet him there. Justinian's fixation grew into an unstoppable force, a tectonic pressure beneath the surface of imperial politics. His disciplined mind, so long chained to legal codes and dry decrees, now focused with unyielding precision on a single obstacle, an ancient law from Augustus. The statute was a relic, a fossilized scrap of morality, forbidding any senator or heir from wedding an actress or prostitute, declaring such a union a disgrace to Rome's dignity. To Constantinople's elite, it was a wall to preserve their bloodlines and social order. To Justinian, it was nonsense standing between him and the only woman whose mind equaled his, whose spirit refused definition. He advanced with surgical resolve, leaving the Senate's elders unsettled and wary. The marble halls of the palace buzzed with new urgency, as scribes and jurists under his sharp command pored over scrolls. Ancient Greek and Latin clauses were unfurled across tables, not studied for wisdom but searched for weaknesses. Justinian's argument were never emotional appeals. They were lawful demolitions skillfully arranged to isolate the outdated statute as an antiquated oddity, a contradiction inside the larger structure of Roman law that upheld the emperor's authority to manage social order for the welfare of the state. He presented it not as a private wish, but as an essential modernization, an act of imperial mercy and practical reform. His immense determination was directed toward his uncle, Emperor Justin, a man whose old age and failing health made him malleable in the grasp of his ambitious and relentlessly driven nephew. In the quiet, incense-laden seclusion of the imperial quarters, Justinian argued his cause. He spoke of stability, of the strength born from an emperor joined with a woman of the people, a symbol of a freshly inclusive Rome. He emphasized Theodora's devotion, her changed character, her keen intelligence, all traits he had carefully documented and publicized. The aged emperor, exhausted and trusting in his nephew's formidable judgment, consented, his hand guided by Justinian's, signed the decree. In 525 AD, the old law was not simply ignored, it was annihilated. A new ruling was declared across the empire, a law that carried no distant impersonal title, but a name that rang through the forums and basilicas with startling closeness. The law of Theodora. It was something of breathtaking, daring force. It was not advice or forgiveness. It was the raw legislative strength of Rome, bent and reshaped for one woman, for Theodora watching from her modest home. The declaration was not merely approval to wed, it was her first intoxicating experience of real power. Not the borrowed sway of a mistress or the fleeting recognition of a performer, but the foundational world-shaping power of the law itself. It was proof of a man's overwhelming desire, and she, with the calm mastery of a skilled art, Isan saw it for what it was, the flawless instrument. She would take this crude material of his fixation and carefully direct it, hammering it into the first unshakable column of her own legitimacy. The road to the throne, once blocked by ancient bias, was now paved with the ink of a new law, and it reached directly to her doorstep. The atmosphere in the great church of the Holy Apostles was thick enough to suffocate. A swirling fog of incense, beeswax, and the clinging odour of masked humanity. Sunbeams fractured by 1,000 jewelled mosaics slanted in dusty bars across the assembled might of the Eastern Roman Empire. Senators stood stiff in their silken robes, their faces carefully arranged into masks of solemnity, but their eyes were bare in their disdain. Theodora felt every scornful look like a physical strike, 1,000 sharp needles piercing the exposed skin of her neck and arms. They saw not an empress, but the bearkeeper's daughter, the hippodrome actress, the woman who had forced her way into their sacred circle with a law that mocked their ancient privileges. Beside her, Justinian stood as a pillar of imperial certainty, his expression a study in gravity as the Patriarch of Constantinople lifted the heavy pearl-encrusted crown. The pressure of the golden gems when it settled upon her brow was a tangible, shocking weight, yet it was nothing. It was a feather compared to the crushing, unseen burden of the aristocracy's hatred pressing down on her, a force more solid than the marble beneath her feet. She did not flinch. She did not avert her gaze. Instead, she lifted herself tall, her spine straightening until she seemed to rise higher, her chin tilting slightly upward. The years of stage discipline did not abandon her now. Her face turned into a calm, unreadable mask, smoother and more impenetrable than ivory carved by hand. The rehearsed stillness of the actress concealed the furious, victorious pounding of her heart. Let them stare, let them witness. Their contempt was full. Well for her resolve. The patriarch blessed her with holy chrism, the oil slick and fragrant on her skin, a sanctity claimed that the men around her would never bestow. The choirs erupted into thunderous soaring notes of the imperial hymn, the sound shaking the very stones of the church. This was the peak of existence, the absolute height of power and honor in the known world, and she had not been born to it. She had clawed her way up from the gutter, from the dust of the arena and the shame of the docks, her fingers bleeding, her soul hardened like steel in the fires of betrayal and survival. As the hymn's echoes dimmed, Theodora allowed her gaze to sweep over the ocean of hostile, glittering faces. She had ascended and she had arrived, and as she stood, crowned Augusta, Empress of Rome, she made a silent iron vow. She would never return, not ever. The only road ahead was forward. The roar that exploded from the hippodrome was not the usual fickle thunder of the crowd cheering on chariots or pantomimes. It was a deeper, uglier noise, a raw-throated howl of unfiltered hatred. It was January 532 AD, and the city was ripping itself apart. The Nika riots, sparked by a failed execution, had grown into an inferno. The long rivalry of the Blues and the Greens, factions that had shaped Theodora's life, had been incinerated in the fire of a united murderous purpose. Their hatred for one another was now a forgotten indulgence, replaced by a single venom aimed at her and at the man she had married. From the high palace windows, the world was ending in flames and rage. The air, once sweet with blossoms and sea salt, was now a suffocating haze of smoke and something heavier, coppery and thick. The life of the city, the graceful boulevards and forums were gone, replaced by a seething, chaotic torrent of humanity. Torches floated in the night like sinister fireflies, and the relentless SS chanting of the mob hammered against the palace walls. "Nika! Nika!" they screamed. "Victory!" But the triumph they sought was their own. They were not shouting for victory in the games, they demanded the overthrow of an emperor, the head of an empress they despised. The palace itself was a besieged island. The massive bronze gates were bolted. The mosaics shuddered with the strike of stones and rams. The polished marble floors, once walked by silent slippered attendants, were now scratched by the frantic boots of desperate guards. Justinian's counselors, men whose faces were usually shields of calm calculation, were pale and sweating, their voices sharp as they clustered around him. Their pleas formed a discordant chorus of fear, all pressing the same frantic advice. Escape. They begged him to flee to the royal barges, to the waiting ships that could carry them from certain death pounding at the doors. Their reasoning was survival, their fear a contagion threatening to dissolve the empire itself. The world they had built, the laws they had issued, the power they had held, all of it was seconds from collapse into ash and blood-soaked ruin, destroyed by the combined will of the raging mob howling for blood beyond the trembling gates. The desperate cries of the advisors filled the chamber, a chorus of surrender that thickened the smoke-choked air. Justinian stood among them, his face pale. The burden of the collapsing empire bent his shoulders. The resolve that had remade laws for a woman seemed to drain from him with each crash against the gates. He glanced toward the secret passage to the sea, and in that look Theodora recognized the end of everything. She did not step forward, she unfolded. Every fragment of her being, every lesson of the streets and the stage, every humiliation borne, every power seized, fused into one electrifying instant of stillness. The frantic men hushed, their pleas dying in their throats as they turned to her. She was no longer only the woman they endured, she was the embodiment of will beyond their comprehension. Her voice, when it came, was not raised. It was the same voice that had once enchanted the hippodrome, but stripped of ornament, sharpened to a blade's edge. It sliced through panic, cold and precise, each word a hammer striking iron. She spoke not of survival, but of legacy. She spoke of the purple, the royal purple they wore, not as clothing, but as a shroud, the noblest shroud a ruler could know. To run was to exist as a beggar, a ghost pleading at foreign courts, forever marked by the throne they had lost. But to remain, to fight, to die in imperial purple, that was eternity. That was a tale that would never fade. Her eyes blazing with terrifying certainty locked with Justinian's. She offered not life versus death, but disgrace versus legend. Her unwavering resolve was more infectious than fear. It was steel poured into the backbone of the empire. She would die as an empress before she fled as a refugee. The choice was made. Doubt vanished from Justinian's face, replaced by fierce clarity. The orders he gave were not of a man seeking escape, but of a commander unleashing war. Generals Belisarius and Mundus, who had held their elite troops in tense readiness, now advanced with deadly focus. While the mob raged, drunk on its fury, packed inside the hippodrome, the soldiers struck with a pincer, sealing its exits. The rioters, who had just cried for a new emperor, were not conquerors but prey trapped in a stone bowl. What came was not a battle but a massacre. The trained soldiers of the empire fell on the crowded, disorderly mass with merciless precision. Blades rose and fell in the torchlight, a grim harvest of flesh. The chants of Nika were drowned by screams of terror and the wet sounds of slaughter. The sands of the hippodrome, the very ground of Theodora's youth, drank deep, its dust turning to mud with blood. By dawn, 30,000 were dead. The revolt was ended in the most absolute way possible. The throne, which had trembled on the edge of ruin, was saved not through talks, but through terror, and secured forever. Theodora had not only preserved her crown, she reforged it in fire and blood, and from then onward none would doubt the iron in the empress. The silence that settled after the Nika riots was not peace, but a feared stability. The blood-stained sands of the hippodrome had become a lesson written in gore, and Theodora, now unquestioned, began to write her own. For 20 years she ruled not as a consort but as a co-ruler, her will stitched into Roman law with the same relentless precision Justinian gave his legal codes. But where his were structures of governance, hers were monuments of compassion carved from the memory of her own pain. She pushed decrees that freed young women from forced prostitution, giving them a choice she never received. She gave mothers rights over their children, power denied to her own mother in hardship. And across the city, she built refuges, quiet sanctuaries where women who had walked her near path could find safety, spin wool and rebuild with dignity. Each law was a ghost laid to rest, a stone set over the grave of the girl she had been. Her greatest and lasting monument, though, rose not from parchment but from stone and mortar. She led the reconstruction of the great church of Hagia Sophia after the riots consumed its earlier form. She poured the empire's wealth and her own indomitable will into its making, directing the architects and mathematicians who dreamed of a dome seeming to hang from heaven. When finished, its immense golden canopy ruled the Constantinople skyline, a permanent mark against the sky. It was more than a church. It was a declaration of imperial power and divine favor, a symbol of a city and an empress who could be shattered but would always rise, greater than before. Forever, that dome would be her outline against the world, the end when it unsolved. Reaved was not from a blade or a mob, but a silent, creeping enemy within. Cancer, the doctor whispered, a crawling growth that consumed her from the inside. The pain was a private humiliation, a slow collapse of the formidable strength that held an empire together. She faced it with the same defiance she had shown rioters, her spirit unbroken even as her body weakened. In 548 AD, in the scented hush of her chambers, Theodora, the bearkeeper's daughter, the actress, the empress, passed away. She was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles, dressed in the purple she never surrendered, the most powerful woman Rome would ever know. The barefoot child who once begged for scraps in the hippodrome had become the empress who reshaped an empire. The woman they tried to crush instead destroyed every limit of what a woman could be. That perhaps remains the darkest truth for those who profit by keeping others bound, that their victims may one day realize the depth of their own power and use it to rebuild the world. In the end, it wasn't her past that made the empress. It was she who took those trials and turned them into a crown burning brighter than any jewel in the imperial treasury. The rest, as they say, is history.